I loved living in Chicago and working as a legal editor of the Chicago Tribune, the largest newspaper between the coasts. Nothing beats the adrenaline rush of the newsroom at deadline. I loved investigating articles and interviewing experts and hitting the streets and diving into records and just trying to find the truth behind a story, while at the same time trying to beat the competition across the street. One of the most amazing stories I ever covered involved a teenager by the name of James Dixon. He was convicted of shooting a police officer and sentenced to prison. Now, of course, there was evidence that backed up his guilt. But one day, I got a phone call from an informant. He told me that Dixon was actually innocent. He didn't shoot the policeman. What had happened is, the policeman was carrying in his pocket an illegal pen gun. That's a gun that looks like a fountain pen, but fires a .22 caliber bullet. He had gotten into a tussle with Dixon. The pen gun had gone off and wounded him. He didn't want to get caught with this illegal gun, so he blamed Dixon for shooting him. Well, when I investigated this evidence based on this new theory, all of the evidence snugly fit together. I did a major expose of the Dixon case on the front page of the Sunday Tribune. A grand jury got the same tip I did. They reopened the case. Dixon was found innocent. The police officer was indicted and later convicted of framing him. It was an absolutely amazing example of how a new examination of the evidence yielded a far different result than the original one. Well, I'd like to invite you to go on a 6-week investigation of our own. This one into the issue of whether Jesus of Nazareth really is the resurrected Son of God. Now, you may have opinions about where you think the evidence is pointing, but what happens if you were to freshly re-examine the evidence with an open mind? I remember when I first did that myself as an atheist, I was absolutely blown away by what I found. It is not an exaggeration to say that my life was changed 180 degrees. So as we begin this investigation, let me ask you, where are you at on your own spiritual journey? As you can see by these interviews we did with some folks in the street, people have all sorts of opinions about where the spiritual evidence points.
Jesus, I would say no doubt lived as a person, but to the extent of what he did, I'm not sure.
If he comes walking into where I work, shows me the signs of the stigmata and tells me he's the Son of God, I might start believing.
I don't believe in God, first of all. Maybe because I grew up in like an age of science.
I have a lot of different thoughts and theories on Jesus, but I don't think coming back from the dead is really possible.
I believe Jesus was a real person. I believe he did live. I guess there are some exaggerations in the Bible, I'd have to say.
I don't believe we'll ever know if Jesus was really what everyone thinks he is. I think it's a lot of folklore. I think it's a lot of historical misrepresentations. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. But I don't think we know, and I don't think we'll ever know, and I don't think there's any way to prove what has been claimed about Jesus for all these years.
I just thought the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving creator of the universe was just an absurd idea on the surface of it. It wasn't even worth my time to check out. As far as Jesus was concerned, I thought that if he existed, and I wasn't sure whether or not he ever did, he was probably a nice guy, he was probably an excellent teacher, but he certainly wasn't the Messiah, and he certainly wasn't the Son of God. Now, my wife was more in spiritual neutral. She was more of an agnostic, whereas I was more antagonistic toward Christians.
I just didn't know where all the pieces fit together. I didn't know who Jesus was or how he fit into the picture. Lee was antagonistic towards God. I was simply confused.
There really was no room for God in my relationship with Leslie when we were dating and when we got married, but you know what? We were happy. We didn't have any problem with that.
When I first started going to church, Lee responded very negatively. He basically told me that this is not what he had signed up for, that when we had gotten married, he had life planned in a way that did not involve church.
My biggest fear with Leslie was that she was going to turn into some religious prude or something, and I thought nothing good can possibly come out of this. But even though I had all these negative ideas of things that were going to happen, in the ensuing months I began to see positive changes in her character and in her values and the way she related to me and the children. And it was winsome and it was attractive. And so when she invited me to go to church with her on January the 20th of 1980, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go. Get her out of this cult, you know, that she's gotten involved in.
He did go in with his reporter's notebook so he could take notes and try to find the scandal.
Well, the pastor gave a talk that day called Basic Christianity, and he just systematically laid out what it is that Christians believe. And my mind was blown because I had all these misconceptions, and he really did straighten me out on a lot of things. And I remember walking out that day saying two things. First of all, I was still an atheist. He didn't convince me that day that God exists. But secondly, I realized if this is true, this has huge implications for my life.
Lee's approach was very different from mine. Mine was mostly a heart issue. I wanted to know that God was real, and the way that was real for me was experientially. And for Lee, it was more about documentation, about being able to have facts that proved it true.
Well, I was a journalist, so there was really no problem with me picking up the phone and calling a scholar and saying, hey, I'm Lee Strobel, I'm with the Chicago Tribune. I'd like some background information about the New Testament. And so I would do that, and I thought it was going to be so easy to expose the fallacious thinking behind Christianity, but as it turned out, it took me almost 2 years of my life to investigate these issues. It really was, in a sense, the most exciting story I'd ever pursued as a journalist. The biographies of Jesus in the New Testament gave me a lot of information about him. But Christians were saying that he is the Son of God. That's a huge step to take to believe that. And so I sought out more scholars so I could pose to them this question: who was Jesus?
Now, this is one of the things I love about Jesus, and it says something to us. His identity is complex. He can't be pigeonholed. He fits no one formula. There's a lot of aspects to who he is. But always, he presents himself as a challenge to the status quo, to preconditioned thinking about what Son of God, what Messiah must be. He's carving out his own niche. He's doing his own thing like a great and creative artist. He is not simply replicating anything from the past. He is taking bits and pieces of prophecies and ideas and wisdom literature and law and you name it, and he's made a whole new gumbo. And he's serving it up, and people don't know what to think. He goes in a synagogue and says some of this stuff, and they go, wow, a new teaching, and with authority. Shazam!
Amazingly, people say, you know, no one teaches like him because he spoke with his own authority. Our sages, our rabbis always taught that you have to teach in the name of someone else. You know, Rabbi so-and-so says in the name of Rabbi so-and-so. That's the way rabbis were taught to teach. Yeshua came and said, you've heard it said, but not what my rabbi taught me, but I say unto you.
And he would clarify, even overrule in some ways, the Old Testament law. Well, this law was given by God himself. For Jesus to say, I am the authoritative interpreter of the law. I am the one who has come to fulfill the law. That's an extraordinary claim, a claim to essentially the authority of God.
The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives. Isaiah 61:1.
It's interesting because when Yeshua went into the synagogue, that was the passage he read. And he says, this day, this verse is fulfilled in your hearing. And basically he's saying, I'm the servant that's described here. I'm the one who fulfills this.
Philip comes to Jesus and asks him to show us the Father, and Jesus says, the one who has seen me has seen the Father. Jesus clearly presents himself as the self-revelation of God. Those who meet Jesus are, in fact, meeting God.
When Jesus is brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, and some of the Sanhedrin members that have gathered the evening that Jesus is arrested, They're trying to find incriminating evidence, they're trying to find incriminating testimony, and they're not doing real well. And finally, the high priest asked Jesus directly, "Tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus says, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand, coming with the clouds of heaven." And there Jesus has combined phrases from Daniel 7 and Psalm 110. Jesus sees himself as this heavenly figure.
More than 80 times in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus is identified as the Son of Man. While the human connotations of the phrase are obvious, a broader interpretation is found in an Old Testament scripture written by the Jewish prophet Daniel.
In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Daniel 7:13.
Many Christians and non-Christians alike hear the phrase Son of Man, they think Son of God refers to his deity and Son of Man refers to his humanity. That's in part true, but in fact Son of Man has a much greater significance than that as well. The title Son of Man, Jesus draws that title from Daniel chapter 7, where a glorious messianic figure comes before the Ancient of Days, a reference to God, and he is given all glory and power and majesty. That portrait of this glorious Messiah is the one that Jesus identifies himself with. He is the Son of Man. So Son of Man doesn't just mean a human being.
His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel 7:14.
Actually, the phrase Son of Man refers to his humanness and his more than humanness. Because no human being can rule forever unless he's a forever person in some kind of way.
Now, often when I begin an investigation, I start with a hunch. Now, that isn't just some wild, unsubstantiated guess, but it's born out of training and experience and where the early evidence seems to point. But while a hunch might be a good place to start, it's not always the best place to end. Journalists and detectives know that you have to go after hard facts and data and evidence. And if those don't support your hunch, then you need to jettison the hunch. Now, it may be that during our investigation, some of your hunches or opinions or preconceptions about Jesus, you may find them falling away. And that's okay, as long as they're being replaced by opinions that are shaped by the evidence that you encounter. I really do hope that by the end of our time together, you're going to be able to reach a verdict in the case for Christ. In the meantime, where would you say that the arrow of the evidence is currently pointing? Toward or away from Jesus being the Son of God?